Close your eyes. Picture ancient Egypt. What do you see? Golden masks, gleaming in the torchlight of a newly opened tomb. The colossal, silent faces of the pyramids, stark against a sapphire sky. The tranquil, animal-headed gods, weighing the hearts of the dead against a single, pure feather. We see a civilization obsessed with beauty, with order, with eternity. A civilization that perfected the art of preservation, that built monuments to cheat death itself, and that promised a glorious afterlife in a verdant paradise known as the Field of Reeds. It is a vision of serenity, of cosmic balance, of a culture in perfect harmony with its gods and its world. But this vision, like a perfect mirage shimmering on the desert horizon, is an illusion. It is the Egypt of the temple walls, the official propaganda of the pharaohs. There is another Egypt, a darker Egypt, hidden in the shadows of the great temples and buried beneath the golden sands. An Egypt where justice was not a gentle weighing of souls, but a brutal, terrifying force. A civilization that believed order was so paramount, so sacred, that any threat to it must be met not just with punishment, but with annihilation. Not just the death of the body, but the obliteration of the soul. Let us transport you there now. Imagine you are not a king, but a common stonemason named Kenro, living in the village of Deir el-Medina, the home of the artisans who built the Valley of the Kings. You have been accused of a crime. Not the simple theft of bread, but something far worse, an act of profound sacrilege. You have been found with a chisel and a small wooden idol, its gilded surface scratched and peeling, an idol pried from the wall of a nobleman's tomb. You have violated the sacred jet, the eternal space of the dead. You have disturbed their slumber and stolen a piece of their immortality. You are dragged from your small mud-brick house and brought before the local magistrates, the Kenbet, who convene in the great gateway of the nearby temple of Medinet Habu. There is no lawyer to speak for you, no jury of your peers. There is only the imposing panel of officials, their faces impassive, their scribe ready with his palette and papyrus. They demand the truth. You deny everything, your voice trembling. The chief magistrate gives a sharp nod. 2 guards force you to the ground, face down in the dust. The soles of your feet are bared to the unforgiving sun. You know what is coming. The bastinado. A guard raises a long, flexible cane of palm wood. The first blow lands with a sickening thwack, sending a bolt of pure fire up your leg. You cry out, "Who were your accomplices?" The magistrate asks, his voice calm, detached. Another blow, and another. The pain is no longer sharp. It becomes a dull, throbbing universe of agony. You would say anything to make it stop. You confess. You name 2 other men from the village, men you barely know, but their names are the first to spill from your pain-addled mind. But your sentence is not more caning. That was merely the interrogation. For your crime, for your act against the cosmic order, the punishment must be absolute. They will take you to the desolate edge of the western desert, a place the locals call the Great Place of Silence, far from the life-giving Nile. They will not grant you the dignity of a coffin or the sacred rites of mummification. A priest is there, but he does not read from the book of the dead to guide your soul. Instead, he recites a curse, condemning your name and spirit to wander in darkness. They force you into a shallow pit, your hands bound, and then they begin to shovel the sand. The first handfuls are a shock, cold and gritty against your skin. Then it begins to cover your legs, a strange, suffocating weight that pins you to the earth. The murmuring of the guards and priests fades as the sand fills your ears. The brilliant, unforgiving sun is the last thing you see before the darkness of the earth closes over your face. You struggle, but it is useless. The weight increases, pressing the air from your lungs. It is not just death you are facing. You are being unmade. You are being returned to the primordial chaos from which the world was born, denied any hope of rebirth, any chance at an afterlife. You are being erased. Welcome to torture history. Today, we journey back thousands of years, to the land of the pharaohs, to uncover the terrifying realities of its justice system. We will look beyond the gilded sarcophagi and explore a world of state-sanctioned mutilation, of live burial, and of a punishment worse than any physical torment, the complete erasure of a person from existence. This is a story that intertwines law, religion, and the deepest fears of the human soul. It is a story that reveals how an ancient civilization's concept of cosmic order gave rise to punishments of unimaginable cruelty. While we often associate the systematic persecution of belief with later periods, we will find that the seeds of what could be called heretic torture were sown in the black soil of the Nile Valley, long before the rise of medieval religion. This is the dark history of justice in ancient Egypt. So, pour yourself a drink, lower the lights, and prepare to enter a world where the greatest crime was not murder, but upsetting the delicate balance of the universe. To truly understand why a punishment like live burial was not only conceivable but was considered just and necessary, we have to grasp the single most important concept in the entire Egyptian worldview, Ma'at. This word is deceptively simple to translate but impossibly vast in its meaning. Ma'at is truth, justice, and order. But it is also the divine, cosmic principle of perfect harmony established by the Creator God at the moment of creation. It was the predictable, life-giving inundation of the Nile. It was the steady, majestic passage of the sun god Ra across the sky in his solar bark. It was the turning of the seasons, the birth of healthy children, the stability of the throne. Ma'at was the very structure of reality, the opposite of the formless, endless, watery chaos known as Isfet that existed before creation and which constantly threatened to return. Everything in Egyptian society, from the grandest temple to the humblest farm, was geared towards maintaining Ma'at. The pharaoh was not just a king. He was the earthly embodiment of the god Horus, and his primary, sacred duty was to uphold Ma'at through ritual and righteous governance. Every law was an expression of Ma'at. A crime, therefore, was not merely an offense against another person or against the state. It was an act of Isfet. It was a small tear in the fragile fabric of the universe. And if enough of these tears appeared, it was believed that the entire world, the precious, beloved land of Egypt, could unravel and collapse back into the primordial chaos. This imbued the Egyptian legal system with a terrifying religious weight. And unlike the Babylonians with their famous Code of Hammurabi, the Egyptians never had a single, unified, written law code that has survived. Justice was more fluid, based on precedent, tradition, and the judgment of officials who were seen as stewards of this divine principle. This lack of a rigid code gave immense power and potential for corruption to the men who wielded the authority of the state. At the apex of this system stood the vizier, the Jadi, the highest official in the land, second only to the pharaoh. We have a remarkable document from the tomb of a new kingdom vizier named Rekhmire, which details the solemn duties of his office. He was instructed to be impartial, to hear the plea of the poor as well as the rich, and to act in conformance with what is given you, to do everything in conformance with the law, to do everything in a measured way. He was the human anchor of Ma'at. But the text also contains a warning. Do not be severe. The dread of a magistrate is that he does justice. This reveals a deep understanding that the power to punish was a fearsome, double-edged sword. Beneath the vizier, justice was administered by local councils, the Kenbet, and their first tool, the one that unlocked almost every case, was the oath. An accused person would be brought before the court and made to swear a solemn oath of innocence in the name of the pharaoh and the great gods. To a deeply religious people, lying under such an oath was a grave sin that would endanger one's soul. But if an oath was not enough, and if there were no witnesses, the court could turn to a more direct form of divine consultation, the oracle. Imagine a festival procession. A golden statue of the god Ammonius is carried on the shoulders of priests through the streets. A man accused of stealing his neighbor's donkey is brought before the procession. A scribe reads out a list of suspects. Was it Mena who stole the donkey? The great statue remains still. Was it Ipui? The statue, through the subtle, coordinated movement of the priests carrying it, lurches forward, nodding yes. To the Egyptians, this was not a trick. It was the god himself rendering a verdict. Case closed. But what if the crime was hidden with no suspects? What if the gods were silent? Then, the agents of Ma'at turned from the divine to the physical. They turned to pain. This brings us back to the bastinado. It was not just a punishment, it was the primary tool of interrogation. The logic, which would be grimly familiar to any inquisitor of medieval religion, was that the truth was a kernel hidden within the shell of the body's deceit, and that pain could crack that shell open. Surviving court transcripts from Deir el-Medina, the very village where our fictional Mason Kenro lived, lay out the process with chilling bureaucratic clarity. The examination of the workman Nachtman. He was brought. The oath was administered to him by the ruler, on pain of being beaten, of having his nose and ears cut off, and of being impaled on the stake. He said, I know nothing. He was examined with the cane on his feet and his hands. He said, I saw so and so. He was handed over to the guards. The progression is laid bare. Oath, denial, torture, confession. This was the engine of Egyptian justice. But a beating, however severe, was temporary. For crimes that represented a more significant threat to Ma'at, the punishments had to be permanent, written not on papyrus, but on the very flesh of the criminal. This is where we enter the realm of judicial mutilation. The Egyptians practiced a chillingly precise form of corporal punishment, a kind of dark symbolic poetry where the part of the body that committed the crime was often the part that was removed. Consider a corrupt official, a scribe who used his position to embezzle grain from the state granaries. His punishment might be to have his hand cut off. Let's imagine this scene. It's not done in a dark dungeon, but in a public square. The man is forced to his knees. His arm is held against a wooden block. The executioner uses not a fine surgical blade, but a heavy, crude knife or chisel, and a mallet. The severing is brutal. The wound is then immediately cauterized with a red-hot piece of metal or plunged into boiling oil to stop the bleeding, a secondary act of agonizing pain. The physical torment is immense, but the true punishment has just begun. This man is now permanently marked. In a society with no vast prison system, mutilation served as a lifelong public brand of shame. A man with one hand was instantly recognizable to everyone as a convicted criminal. He was a walking warning, a living monument to the consequences of defying the state. He would struggle to find work. He would be an outcast. He had suffered a social death. But for an ancient Egyptian, the horror went infinitely deeper. It extended into eternity. The Egyptians believed the afterlife was a physical reality, a perfected version of life on earth. To enjoy it, you needed your body to be whole. Your mummified corpse, your cot, was the physical anchor for the various parts of your soul. Your ba, your personality, often depicted as a human-headed bird. Your ka, your life force or spiritual twin. Your ren, your name, and your shut, your shadow. If your body was incomplete in this life, it would be incomplete for all of eternity. How could you sow and reap in the idyllic field of reeds if you had no hand to hold the plow? How could you breathe the sweet breath of life offered by the gods if your nose had been cut off? The most common form of mutilation, reserved for a range of offenses from adultery to desertion to desecrating temples, was the cutting off of the nose and sometimes the ears. The punishment was so common that the Greeks knew of a specific penal colony on the desolate border of the Sinai desert called Rhinocolura, literally, the place of the cut-off noses. Here, thousands of condemned criminals were exiled, a grotesque community of the disfigured, forever marked by their crimes, living reminders of the pharaoh's justice. To be sent there was to be sentenced to an eternal disability, a permanent stain on your soul. But even mutilation was not enough for some crimes. There was a tier of punishment that went beyond marking the body and moved towards its complete destruction. One of these was forced labor. For serious crimes that didn't quite merit immediate execution, criminals could be sentenced to a living death in the state's quarries or mines. They would be sent to the vast sandstone quarries of Gebel el-Silsila, or worse, the turquoise and copper mines of the Sinai, a place known as the Land of Dread. Here, branded with a hot iron in the shape of the set animal, the symbol of chaos and disorder, they would toil under the brutal sun. Chained together, fed minimal rations, they would hack at the rock face from dawn until dusk. The fine silica dust would fill their lungs, leading to a slow, painful death from silicosis. Life expectancy was counted in months, not years. This was not a sentence of rehabilitation. It was a sentence of being worked to death, your life force literally extracted by the state until there was nothing left. It was a slow, agonizing negation of your existence. And then there were the crimes so heinous, so fundamentally opposed to Ma'at, that they demanded the ultimate price, a swift and terrible negation. These were not just crimes against people, but crimes against the gods and against the dead. The two most serious crimes an Egyptian could commit were treason against the pharaoh and the desecration of a tomb. Treason, of course, was a direct attack on the divine order because the pharaoh was a living god. The most famous case of treason comes from the reign of Ramesses III in the 12th century BCE, in what is known as the Harem Conspiracy. A secondary wife of the king, named Tai, plotted to assassinate the pharaoh and place her own son, Pentar, on the throne. The plot was incredibly sophisticated. It involved not only an armed uprising planned by a high-ranking general, but also a campaign of black magic. Conspirators crafted wax figurines of the king and his guards and recited spells to weaken their limbs and overthrow the king. The plot was discovered, and the surviving trial records on the judicial papyrus of Turin are a masterpiece of dark history. 40 people were put on trial, a cross-section of Egyptian high society. Court officials, scribes, harem women, military officers. The senior plotters were found guilty and condemned to death. But the state, in a strange act of class distinction, did not deign to execute them itself. They were sentenced to take their own lives within the courtroom. This was considered a more dignified death, perhaps allowing their families to recover the bodies for a proper burial. But for the lower-ranking conspirators and the prince Pentar, the fate was different. The records state they were executed, and scholars believe this likely meant a more brutal public death. Pentar himself, the would-be usurper, was either executed or forced to commit suicide. The mummy of an unknown man found in a plain, unmarked coffin, contorted in agony as if from strangulation or poison, is believed by some to be his. His royal name was denied him, his chance at a kingly afterlife utterly destroyed. But even a plot against the living god-king paled in comparison to the crime that struck at the very heart of Egyptian civilization. Tomb robbing. A tomb was not a grave. It was a house of eternity. An Akhe. It was a meticulously constructed machine designed to launch the deceased into the afterlife and sustain them there for millions of years. It contained their preserved body, their name, their possessions, everything they would need, and the magic spells to navigate the perils of the underworld. To break into a tomb was to murder someone in the afterlife. You weren't just stealing gold. You were stealing their immortality. This was the ultimate act of Isfet, and during the late New Kingdom it reached epidemic proportions. The authority of the pharaohs was weakening, and organized gangs, often with the collusion of corrupt local officials, began to systematically plunder the sacred necropolis of Thebes, including the Valley of the Kings itself. The tombs of the greatest pharaohs, Seti I and Ramesses the Great, were desecrated. It was a national crisis, a sign that Ma'at itself was failing. The surviving papyri from this period read like a modern true crime thriller. We have the confession of a stonemason named Amenpenufer, extracted under the bastinado. He describes in blunt detail how he and his gang violated the pyramid tomb of a 17th dynasty king. We went to rob the tombs, and we found the pyramid of King Sekemreshed-toi. We took our copper tools and we forced a way into the pyramid of this king. We found the august mummy of this king. A large number of amulets and jewels of gold were upon his neck, and his headpiece of gold was upon him. The august mummy of this king was completely bedecked with gold. We stripped off the gold, and we set fire to their coffins. We took their furniture, and divided it among ourselves. The confession is shocking in its brazenness. For a crime of this magnitude, the state needed to respond with a force that mirrored the cosmic chaos the robbers had unleashed. This is where we see the most extreme forms of capital punishment: burning alive and impalement. Burning was a punishment of terrifying theological significance. The entire purpose of mummification, a process that took 70 days, was to preserve the physical body, the khat, so the soul would have a home to return to. To be burned alive was to have your body utterly destroyed, turned to ash. It was a complete and total denial of an afterlife. It was to ensure that your soul, your ba, would be left a homeless, gibbering ghost for all eternity, never to reach the field of reeds. The fire was a tool of ultimate annihilation, a way to erase a person from the cosmic ledger, a form of heretic torture for the criminal who had defied the most sacred tenets of the state religion. Even more brutal was impalement. The condemned would be forced onto a sharpened wooden stake, which would be driven up through their abdomen and torso, carefully missing vital organs to prolong the agony. They would then be hoisted into the air and left to die a slow, agonizing death from exposure, dehydration, and the eventual failure of their internal systems, often taking hours or even days. This was a spectacle of state power, a gruesome warning displayed publicly, often near the site of the crime, to deter others. It was a demonstration that the forces of Ma'at would not just defeat chaos, but would utterly desecrate it in the most public and horrific way imaginable. And this brings us back to that pit in the desert. Live burial. While burning and impalement were about annihilation through destruction and public display, live burial was about annihilation through negation and inversion. A proper Egyptian burial was a complex, beautiful ritual. The body was purified, anointed, wrapped in hundreds of yards of fine linen, adorned with amulets, and placed in a coffin inscribed with protective spells. The opening of the mouth ceremony was performed to magically reanimate the senses for the afterlife. The tomb was sealed, a perfect, eternal home. Live burial was the systematic inversion of every single one of those acts. No purification, only filth. No anointing, only the dry scrape of sand. No protective wrapping, only the crushing weight of the earth. No spells for guidance, only silence and suffocation. No eternal house, only a nameless, shallow pit. You were being consigned to the earth like an animal, actively and ritually excluded from the Egyptian universe. You were being made nothing. This fear of erasure, of ceasing to exist not just physically but metaphysically, was the ultimate psychological weapon of the Egyptian state. And it led to the one punishment that could be inflicted even on the most powerful person in the land, the pharaoh himself. This brings us to the story of Akhenaten, the heretic king. His reign in the 14th century BCE is one of the most bizarre and revolutionary periods in all of world history. Ascending the throne as Amenhotep IV, he launched a religious revolution that shook Egypt to its core. He abandoned the sprawling, ancient pantheon of gods, the mighty Ammonius Ra of Thebes, the resurrected Osiris, the magical Isis who had been worshipped for over 1,500 years. He declared that there was only one true god. The Aten, represented not as a human or animal, but as the physical disk of the sun, its rays ending in little hands that offered the Ankh, the symbol of life, to the royal family. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. He closed the vast, wealthy temples of the old gods, effectively defunding the most powerful priesthood in the land. He moved the entire capital of Egypt from Thebes to a new, purpose-built city in the middle of the desert called Akhenaten, the horizon of the Aten. He oversaw a radical shift in art, from the formal, idealized figures of the past to a strange, almost grotesque naturalism, depicting himself with a long face, wide hips, and a protruding belly. For the Egyptian establishment, the dispossessed priests of Amonisare, the traditionalist military, the old nobility, this was not just a theological disagreement. This was the ultimate act of Isfet. The king, whose very job was to uphold Ma'at and serve as the intermediary to the traditional gods, had instead declared them false and wiped them from the state religion. He had severed the relationship between Egypt and the divine forces that had sustained it for millennia. In their eyes, he was the greatest heretic, the ultimate criminal. While Akhenaten lived, his power was absolute. But after his death, the backlash was swift and total. His son, the boy king Tutankhaten was forced to abandon the Atenist religion and restore the old gods. The court moved back to Thebes. But this wasn't enough. Akhenaten had committed a crime against Ma'at so profound that his memory itself had to be destroyed. What followed was a systematic, state-sponsored campaign of damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory. This was the ultimate Egyptian punishment, a form of heretic torture applied to a person's very existence. Akhenaten's name became a curse. His statues were toppled, smashed, and ground into dust. His temples at Karnak were painstakingly dismantled block by block, the decorated stones, known as talatat, used as anonymous filler material for the foundations of new pylons built by later kings. And most importantly, his name and image were methodically chiseled off every monument, every temple wall, every stele in Egypt. Teams of workers were sent out with chisels and hammers with a single, chilling task, to make it as if Akhenaten had never existed. To understand the full horror of this, we must return to the Egyptian concept of the soul. The name was not just a label. It was a fundamental component of a person's being, as real and as vital as their heart or their liver. To speak a name was to make the person exist. To read a name inscribed on a tomb wall was to give that person life in the hereafter, to allow them to partake in the offerings. To erase the name was to sever that eternal lifeline. It was to kill them a second time, a final metaphysical death from which there was no return. It was to ensure their soul would have no identity, no anchor, and would dissolve into the chaos of non-existence. On official king lists compiled by later pharaohs like Seti I, the entire Amarna period, the reigns of Akhenaten, his mysterious successor Smenkhare, Tutankhamun, and I was simply omitted. History was rewritten to jump directly from Akhenaten's father to Hormheb, the general who founded the next dynasty. They had literally cancelled him from reality. For 3,000 years, Akhenaten was a ghost, known only from vague references as the criminal of Akhenaten or that enemy. His story was lost, buried under the sands of his abandoned city and chiseled from the memory of his own civilization. It was only with the rediscovery of Akhenaten in the 19th century and the painstaking reassembly of his story that this heretic king was brought back from the oblivion his people had condemned him to. The justice system of ancient Egypt, therefore, presents us with a fascinating and horrifying paradox. It was a civilization that celebrated life and was obsessed with achieving immortality. Yet, this very obsession created a system that could mete out punishments of unimaginable cruelty, all designed to deny that same immortality to those who transgressed. The fear of chaos, Isfet, was so great that it justified a form of justice that was itself chaotic in its brutality. The punishments of mutilation, live burial, burning, and the erasure of memory were not the acts of a primitive or savage people. They were the cold, calculated instruments of a highly organized, deeply religious state, all enacted in the name of preserving cosmic order. They reveal a dark history that is far more complex than just mummies and pyramids. It's a history of how a society's deepest beliefs about life, death, and the universe can be twisted into a justification for absolute control and terrifying cruelty. The desire to purge the heretic, to erase the non-believer, to annihilate the threat to the established order, these are not impulses that began with the inquisitors of medieval religion. They are ancient fears, carved in hieroglyphs on temple walls and written in the blood and sand of the Nile Valley, a timeless warning of the terrifying things people will do in the name of keeping their world from falling apart. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of crime and punishment in ancient Egypt. The past is never as simple as it seems, and often the most beautiful civilizations harbor the darkest secrets. If this journey into the dark history of Egyptian justice has intrigued you, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to Torture History. Make sure to click the notification bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into the shadows of the past. And now I want to ask you, having heard the details, what do you find more terrifying? The immediate physical agony of a punishment like impalement, the living death of the minds, or the cold, eternal oblivion of having your name, your memory, and your very soul systematically erased from existence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your insights and discussions are what bring this history to life. Until next time, remember that every golden mask hides a human face, and every story of order is also a story of the fear of chaos.